I will start by introducing myself, and after my introduction, I will switch off the camera so that it doesn't interfere with my internet connection. So once again, good afternoon and good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Mariana Pose. I am a board member of AfHEA, and I will be moderating today's session. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. So we'll proceed. So today's webinar is about policy brief writing. This webinar is part of ANISA's efforts to bridge the gap between sexual and reproductive health and rights, research and policy. ANISA stands for Addressing Neglected Areas of Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights in Sub-Saharan Africa. It is a 7-year initiative running from 2024 to 2031, co-funded by Global Affairs Canada, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and the International Development Research Center, who are also funding this webinar. ANISA supports gender transformative sexual and reproductive health and rights projects for underserved populations across Sub-Saharan Africa. As the Health Policy and Research Organization for West and Central Africa within the ANISA initiative, the African Health Economics and Policy Association, AfHEA, plays a role in supporting West Central Africa implementation research teams on capacity strengthening on gender transformative research, knowledge translation, and policy engagement. Currently, AfHEA is supporting 5 implementation research teams, 2 of these in Burkina Faso, 1 in Ghana, 1 in Nigeria, and 1 in Senegal. This capacity strengthening webinar on policy brief writing directly addresses the research to policy gap in sexual and reproductive health and rights in Sub-Saharan Africa. This research to policy translation gap is something that is rarely taught in academics, but often learned on the job and through continuous professional development. AfHEA is therefore pleased to contribute to addressing to this gap by organizing this webinar, which we believe will benefit not only the ANISA implementation research teams, but also the broader AfHEA community of members and indeed researchers in Africa. We are delighted to be joined by Professor Mina Nomtondo, who will give the opening remarks, and Professor John Ataguba, who will be the resource person. Professor Nomtondo is a full professor of dermatology at Joseph Kizerbo University in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. She is also a health economist and founding president of the Burkinabe College of Health Economics. She also serves as a board member of AfHEA. Professor Ataguba is the executive director of AfHEA. He is a health economist and the Canada Research Chair in Health Economics at the University of Manitoba. He is also the co-editor-in-chief of SSM Health Systems, a fellow of the Pan-African Scientific Research Council, and a research fellow for the Partnership for Economic Policy Network. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Cape Town.
It looks like your prompt is
from the University of Cape Town, and has about 20 years of experience in many areas, including policy advice to governments, technical support to countries, teaching health economics and health systems and leadership. He has significant work experience in several countries in sub-Saharan Africa, including Nigeria, Rwanda, and South Africa, and he is a recipient of several competitive awards, both locally and internationally. He continues to serve as an advisor nationally and to international agencies, including the World Health Organization. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few brief housekeeping points. Participants are advised to mute their mics so that we do not have interruptions during the session. There is simultaneous French and English interpretation available for the webinar. Participants are therefore encouraged to use the interpretation function to switch between whichever language they are comfortable with, French or English. They can also speak either French or English during their interventions, depending on whichever language they are comfortable with. The slides will be shared after the webinar. We will have opening remarks, after which we will have the presentation from our resource person, and thereafter we will have questions and answer session. You are welcome to submit questions through the chat or QA function at any time during the presentation. Also, during the questions and answer session, we will give the opportunity to participants to ask questions or make contributions. Participants are advised to keep their questions or contributions short so that others can also have a chance to contribute to the discussion. During the QA session, participants who wish to ask questions can raise their hands and they will be recognized and given the opportunity to ask their questions. Again, they should be brief so that others can also have the opportunity to talk and contribute. We will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the session. I am now pleased to invite Professor Nomtondo to give the welcoming remarks. Professor Nomtondo, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Mariana. Let me speak in French. Bienvenue, bonjour, monsieur. Bonjour, camarades du Burkina Faso. Bonjour à tous les pays d'Afrique du Centre et de l'Ouest. AfHEA vous adresse chaleureuse salutations. Et merci d'avoir pris le temps de nous joindre pour ce webinaire aujourd'hui. AfHEA est ravi de pouvoir compter au fil des années sur votre participation active à ces activités. Et l'un des principaux mandats de AfHEA est le renforcement des capacités et plusieurs personnes et structures en ont déjà bénéficié. Et nous continuons à honorer ce mandat en proposant aujourd'hui ce webinaire sur la rédaction des notes d'orientation politique ou policy brief avec un accent particulier sur la santé sexuelle et reproductive. Communiquer des résultats de la recherche aux décideurs politiques pour la prise de décision est une compétence essentielle que les chercheurs doivent apprendre à perfectionner. Bien que la majeure partie des travaux de recherche circulent déjà au sein des cercles académiques et scientifiques, très peu sont transmises aux autres parties prenantes, notamment les décideurs politiques et les responsables de prise de décision. Les chercheurs doivent comprendre que les données probantes sont utilisées pour éclairer le processus d'élaboration des politiques. La nature des informations dont les décideurs politiques ont besoin est souvent différente des résultats de recherche qui figurent dans les articles, mémoires et autres revues scientifiques. Les décideurs apprécient des informations claires concise, exploitable, rédigée dans un langage facile et compréhensible. Il est donc important que les chercheurs apprennent l'art et la science de communiquer leurs recherches auprès de ces décideurs afin d'accroître l'utilité de leurs travaux et d'augmenter les chances de leur prise en compte dans les décisions politiques. Une note d'orientation politique est un outil synthétique fondé sur des données probantes qui traduit les résultats de recherches scientifiques en recommandations claires, concises, destinées à un public politique spécifique. C'est l'un des moyens les plus efficaces pour combler le fossé entre la recherche et l'élaboration des politiques. Cependant, la rédaction de cette note exige un ensemble particulier de compétences, de formulations qui sont rarement enseignées dans les formations académiques classiques. Et ce webinaire va permettre vraiment de répondre à ce manque de compétences-là. Il offre donc un cadre méthodique aux participants pour traduire les résultats en produits synthétiques pertinents, adaptés aux contraintes de temps, aux priorités et au contexte politique des décideurs. Ce webinaire de renforcement des capacités s'inscrit dans le cadre du mandat de AfHEA au fil des années et il est fièrement soutenu par l'initiative Aborder les domaines négligés de la santé, des droits sexuels et reproductifs en Afrique subsaharienne, qui est cofinancé par Affaires mondiales Canada, les instituts de recherche, le Centre de recherche pour le développement international. Et AFIA est un organisme qui a été sélectionné pour accompagner cette initiative. En tant qu'organisme de soutien, AFIA apporte son soutien à 5 équipes de recherche en Afrique centrale et de l'Ouest. Et bien que le public cible immédiat de ce webinaire soit les équipes de recherche, le sujet est pertinent pour l'ensemble des chercheurs en Afrique subsaharienne et notamment les chercheurs en début de carrière. Et c'est pourquoi nous avons ouvert ce webinaire au bénéfice de l'ensemble de la communauté de recherche. Et notre facilitateur du jour, qui est un économiste de la santé très expérimenté et a travaillé depuis de nombreuses années aux côtés des décideurs politiques au plus haut niveau. Il abordera ce sujet en s'appuyant donc sur toute son expérience pratique qu'il a accumulée au fil des années. Je vous invite donc à une écoute active et je vous souhaite une belle séance. Je vous remercie. Thank you, Maria.
Professor Namtondo, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I am pleased to invite Professor Ataguba to take the floor. Professor Taguba, over to you.
Thank you very much. Obrigada. This is very, I'm very excited to be here and also to help facilitate this discussion around policy, or even beyond that. To start, I want to reiterate that there is interpretation in case you want to listen in French or in English. I will speak in English, so if you are comfortable in French, interpretation is available. You can click on the 3 dots with more at the bottom of your screen, hopefully, and you'll be able to change your language to English or French. I will share my slides now. We will wait until we finish presentations to take questions so that we don't interrupt and we're able to finish up on time, else we'll be here forever. As it has been introduced, I will be talking about writing a good policy brief. I've been introduced in terms of who I am. I will skip this as well. I want to first start by telling you there are many, many knowledge translation products that are available out there, many of them. And the choice between which to use is determined likely by what you want to achieve. If what you want to achieve is you targeting an academic audience, it's a different kind of knowledge translation product. If you're targeting people on the streets, there is a different knowledge translation product that you use. So I have them grouped here into broadly 4 of them, for example. One is around building and sharing evidence. It could be writing journal papers for an academic audience. It could be producing research briefs. I won't talk much about them, or having abstracts submitted for conferences, whether local or international conferences. Or sometimes it could be technical reports based on, it could be a consultancy that has been done, or it could be based on work that's been commissioned by a particular funder, for example. You could have systematic reviews, etc. So in the context of sexual and reproductive health, there are many issues that you may cover in research articles or in systematic reviews, etc. There is also another important knowledge translation product, which is to inform policy and decisions. Decisions could happen even within families. So when we talk about decisions, not just about the policymaker sitting somewhere within the Ministry of Gender or Ministry of Health or Social Welfare, decisions happen regarding sexual and reproductive health in families. Decisions happen at schools. Decisions happen at places of worship, for example. These are very important things to keep in mind where you want to reach your audience. And when we talk of informing policy and decisions, things that come to mind include policy briefs, evidence synthesis notes, fact sheets, infographics, presentation and slides. And another one which I didn't put here is an elevator pitch, where you kind of interface with the policymaker and you only have 2 or 3 minutes to kind of drill down your point, and you have to be as concise as possible. Another one of interest is around supporting practice and implementation. You have a research that's been done, or you have an area you want to document in terms of how to do things. You might have a guideline document that you develop. It could be a checklist to say, well, if you want to do A, whatever A is, you need to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in a sequential order or in a kind of haphazard way, but there has to be some guidance in terms of how you move from one level to another. You could also be looking at developing training materials for how to train. It could be young adolescents on how to be more hygiene friendly in terms of how they handle things. Or it could be around how they negotiate relationships. You could have training materials on that, and there could be many other things you might look at. And lastly, you might want to communicate beyond your narrow audience to the wider public. It could be as simple as press release. Press releases or media briefs, usually to media houses. It could be newspapers, it could be radio, it could be television, or in the modern day now, we have social media. Social media is one that almost everyone subscribes to, where you put out posts in bits and people can digest immediately. Could be short videos. Some of you are used to YouTube Shorts, for example. It could be podcasts or what we're doing now, webinars. It's also a knowledge translation, and we're having 2 of them built in one. We have knowledge translation in terms of webinar happening, and we also have how to do a policy brief. So there are 2 kind of areas we'll cover here. You could look at newsletters, IEC, information, education, and communication materials, for example. But I will hone in on just one aspect, which is informing policy and decisions. Let's focus on policy briefs, how to do a good policy brief that would translate evidence into policy, messages that are digestible by people who have some kind of actionable power. You don't do a policy brief to someone without actionable power. Not that they are not important, but they don't have actionable power in that regard. The fact that you have a president doesn't mean the president has actionable powers in everything. If it is how you want your relationship with your wife to be at home, you cannot tell the president, write a policy brief to the president on how you want your relationship with your wife or your husband or your boyfriend or girlfriend to be in your house. Your president has no actionable power in that regard. So you need to figure out who you need to target for a specific action, not just because the person is very powerful, but the person needs to be powerful in that area you're dealing with. The same way too, a minister of finance has actionable power to release funds, but you cannot go and meet the minister of education to release funds, or write a policy brief to the minister of education to release funds for something that is not education related. He or she would ask, but what can I do? So you need to know who to target at different points in time. So now that said, what exactly is a policy brief? It's a question you would want to pose immediately. A policy brief can be described in different ways. One way of putting it is to see it as a concise summary that kind of focuses on a particular issue of interest. And that issue of interest has to be specific, not many issues scattered in one. And there has to be some policy options to address the challenge that you have posed in the document or the brief. Your recommendations should be actionable and should provide as much as possible the best possible options. There might be different options, but within the context you're operating, best possible options. An option may be useful in Ghana, but if you move it to Burkina Faso, even though they're neighboring countries, it may not be useful. A context may be useful in Angola. If you move it to Mozambique, it may not be feasible, partly because of culture. It might even be religion. It might also be geography. So one has to understand this in communicating to different audiences. We may also look at a policy brief as a short document, usually very short. It's not a very long document. We'll talk about the length in a while. It's a short document that presents key findings and recommendations that will help move a research output into a different realm that can be actionable by a non-specialized audience. It could also be seen as a medium for you to explore an issue in depth, such that you can distill lessons that have been learned from research and how you can move from concrete research to implementation. Your traditional research to more implementation, moving it from hardcore science to soft implementation in terms of reaching the last person. It could be seen as a vehicle for you to provide policy advice, usually to policymakers or decision makers, such that they will be able to change practice, change an existing policy, or modify them in a way that aligns with science. There has to be evidence behind this. So the fact that it's a policy brief is not a thumbsuck document where you just put together things that you think, but those policy recommendations have to have strong research or evidence backing. And the evidence backing that the policy recommendations will have should have flown from a rigorous research that follows standard research methodologies, whether it is qualitative, it's quantitative, it's mixed, or implementation research, or whatever research it is, it has to be evidence-based and sound. It has to be actionable. Usually, a policy brief should focus on a topic, not just everything. So if you're looking at a problem, the problem might be, we have a lot of young girls who marry before the age of 15 in a country, let's say Niger. If there are a lot of young girls who marry before the age of 15 in Niger, and you want to target that particular problem or challenge, there are many things loaded in it. As simple as it seems, like many young girls below 15 years being married. It seems simple, just one thing, deal with marriage, but it has a lot of dimensions. So if one dimension is education, you may want to focus on education because the person who has actionable power for education is different from a person who has actionable power for maybe religion or faith issues, morals. You might be targeting parents for some things to do with morals. You might be targeting some religious leaders in terms of maybe faith-based issues to be able to encourage girls not to get married on time. Or you may be able to target schools to educate not just the girls who may not have power to say, well, don't get me married. But you may want to target those who you think through education may be able to influence early marriage, for example. And it's also important to also educate the young girls on how to go about this in terms of who do they need to approach, what government institutions or structures exist for them to lodge complaints if they feel they are being married on time. So they are aware that this exists and is a problem or it's a challenge society is dealing with. So there are many ways to approach this, and any way you want to approach it, you approach it differently in terms of how you message. That's what I wanted to put out there. And it must be a standalone piece. Don't try to always link it up to a research. The reason is, it's not that it is not linked to research. The reason is if you give a policymaker a policy brief and you keep saying, if you read page 12 of the main paper, page 20 of the main paper, the policymaker begins to doubt the document they're holding. It means the document is worthless. The main document that I should be reading is that page 20, page 30, or wherever it is. And the moment you lose credibility, you can't go further. The policymaker feels like, well, this is not what I should be looking at. I should be looking at the bigger document. But when he or she grabs the bigger document, they may not be able to make sense of it. So it's important to keep it standalone as much as possible. At the end of a policy brief, I'll tell you how you may be able to jot down if you want to read more about this, contact me. You put your name, your contact details, and maybe the reference to the major paper where it's been published, or it's the working paper or whatever. But that is usually at the end, so it doesn't distract the reader in any way. Avoid jargon as much as possible. No jargon. If you cannot read it at the age of 18 and understand it, it's definitely not worth writing. So if, for example, you write and say, well, there's catastrophic expenditure for those people who use services for sexual and reproductive health, and then one who is not understanding what catastrophic expenditure is lost. So avoid such technical terms or jargon. Usually keep policy briefs short, between 2 and 4 pages. It may be longer, it may be shorter. It depends on many criteria. But as a rule of thumb, 2 to 4 pages will be fine. Sometimes you may end up having 6 pages if it is based on something else. And that could happen. So it's important to keep that in mind. It's not rigid per se, but a lot needs to go into it in terms of thought when you design a good policy brief. Now, other key points to note before we go into the structure of a policy brief. One is you need to know who your audience is. If you have no clue who your audience is, you have not started. Because if I wake up now, I want to go and speak to the Minister of Health, I know what I'm going to tell the Minister of Health. I will not tell the Minister of Health about something that has to do with agriculture or about income generating activities for informal workers. The Minister of Health will like, okay, how am I going to help you with income generating activities for informal workers? I'm not a Minister of Labor. I don't even know what you're talking about. I have no idea. So your audience determines to a great extent what you put in your policy brief. If you're unable to identify an audience, then you've not started. The first thing is identify your audience. You have your problem you have at hand. So you now need to identify who do I need to target to be able to solve that problem. You may brainstorm. If you don't know who the audience may be, you can ask questions, feel free. The audience should be knowledgeable in that area that you're dealing with. If I'm going to Minister of Labor, I expect that the Minister of Labor understands a bit about hiring informal workers. If I'm going to the Minister of Health, and I assume the Minister of Health will understand the key health challenges in my country. If there is high incidence, prevalence rather, of vaginal fistula, I should expect that the minister understands, so that if I'm going to the minister knows that this is a problem that can be solved by him or her. And the minister or the person who you are targeting, the audience, it mustn't be a minister. I'm using minister, for example, but it mustn't. It could be a mayor, it could be anybody. It could also be a permanent secretary. Your audience should be open to your message. Now, this is critical. It becomes dead on arrival if the message is antagonistic. Now, I'm writing to change a particular policy. It could be female genital mutilation. And for example, it could be that the person who you want to send this to comes from a community where they hold it as a cultural practice that they have been practicing for centuries. And it's something that is embedded in their culture. And he or she is the one who is the person I'm sending this policy brief to. You now need to be strategic in how you communicate. You don't just go straight on and say, well, your community does X, which is bad, barbaric, blah, blah, blah. Chances are that you've lost it. It's dead on arrival. You're condemning my culture. You're condemning my people. Even though the message is good, but you've lost it. You want to be diplomatic as much as possible to be able to pass your message through. The message needs to sink in for policy to change. If it doesn't sink in, policy doesn't change. So it's important to keep that in mind. And how do you reach this audience? Sometimes you need to ask very, very basic questions. It could be, what do I need to do to change the situation, given the context I already know? Who can assist? Who has the power to influence? Who are the key stakeholders that are in support that I may be able to contact to get my message through? Avoid lengthy briefs, like I said earlier, because they distract the author, the reader, and then you lose them. Sometimes you may want to reach the minister, but you know who the minister listens to the most. Try and get hold of that person. If the person is Felix, get Felix to get to the minister. If the person is Mary, get Mary to get to the minister. If the person is Aisatu, get Aisatu to get to the minister. So it's important to understand who has power to influence and who has power to influence the influencer. In nowadays parlance, we use the word influencers. So some of you already used to the term influencer. So you may want to get an influencer to influence the main person you want to get in touch. You want to use power persuasion. Be in as much as you are a bit political in how you present, you have to also be persuasive. Persuasive is, I'll come to it in a while. It's very powerful. You try to flip it in terms of, if you don't do something, look at the repercussions. Look at what you're going to miss. People listen to you when you say, if you don't do X, Y would happen. Then please do Y, because Y is good for the society, for our society. It's not convincing enough. Be very persuasive. I will tell you a bit on how that will be in a while. If you write it to the minister and you know the minister is pushing a particular agenda, coin it in such a way that it fits within the minister's current agenda. Oh, then this will help me deal with or kind of achieve my own already set out agenda. The minister will be more receptive to such than something that is in line with what the opposition, maybe the minister is in opposition with a particular minister or something, and then you're basically pushing the other minister's agenda, and then you've lost it. So you have to be very strategic in how you do that. So write in terms of benefits and advantages, and try to be to present how urgent the situation is. It's very critical when you make it urgent. So this is just a snapshot of the structure of a good policy brief. It mustn't be hard and fast as you see it. You may use synonyms rather than what you see on the screen. But generally, you should have some kind of summary. It could be a highlight. Some people call it highlights. Some people call it summary. Some people call it executive summary, usually optional, but it's good way of getting the reader to even get, a snapshot of the entire document that is already small anyway. Then you have your usual introduction, the approach, or the method, how you went about doing what you're doing. But in a non-technical way, I'll get there. Your results or findings or what emanates from your research. You need to have conclusion, policy recommendations, and implications. They are two different things. I'll tell you a bit about them in a while. So executive summary is basically used to distill the essence of a brief. It provides you with a quick overview for people who are busy. Is this something I really want to read further? Please use this as a selling point. If you make it catchy, you will most likely keep the audience. We'll talk a bit about aesthetics. Aesthetics matters, not just the fact that the text is there already, but the appeal it has to the eye is very critical for someone to engage with the materials. Entice readers to go further, and it should appear on the front page, not at the back. And the saddest, well, not saddest, the strange thing is that it's written last, but it's appearing on the front page. So it's the last thing written, but it appears on the front page. We have the introduction section. You may not call it introduction. You may call it something that ties it straight to the topic. It could, if you're dealing with female genital mutilation, use that as an example. There are many other things. You may say female genital mutilation in Nigeria. Why are we in this mess? So you could see immediately, like, it sets the message straight up in terms of introduction. And then the reader would want to know the why. Why are we there? And how can we move the agenda forward? These are key questions or things that will go into the introduction. You answer the why question. Why are we in that mess? You describe issues and contextualize them. Like I say, what's good in Niger may not be good in Nigeria, even though Nigeria has an extra few letters after Niger. So it doesn't mean that when you do something in Niger, you just add a few things and it becomes Nigeria. No, it might be two different contexts. So it's important to keep that in mind. You should also be able to explain the significance and urgency of the issue and describe your objectives, not in the scientific way you see it written. This research has the following objective. Objective 1, to determine XYZ, to assess ABC. No, not in those kind of technical way or fashion. You want to create curiosity for the rest of the research, because it's a build-up. Keep in mind what you're doing, you're building up. And it's like crescendo. You're going to a stage where you reach the peak, but you want the reader to be sustained. Oh, what's next? What's next? Oh, it's getting exciting. Once you get the reader in that mood, you're most likely going to get to the end well. Then the next section is the approach or method that you use. This should be brief. Avoid jargon. Don't bring in, oh, we ran a regression analysis, oh, we did adjusted odds ratio, we did split sample analysis, or we did interpretative analysis, or it was content analysis, or it was blah, blah, blah. You can think of all the jargon you may want to bring from qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods. If I have never gone through any qualitative methods class, you say you're doing content analysis, or like, okay, what content are we analyzing? Or if I've never done any class in quantitative analysis, you say you're doing a logistic regression. Like, what is logistics, for example? Excuse me. So it's important to keep your audience in mind. Your audience should be a layperson, and you don't want to use jargon or technical terms. Explain how the study was conducted in simple language, very, very simple language, not high-level language that is only understood by academics. try to talk about who conducted the study, where the study is located. If it is a study that's applicable to the entire country or even beyond, feel free to say it. Or if it's a particular area, it might be that you're dealing with women on the mountains in a certain country, because a country with many mountains. If your research is focused on women who live on a mountain somewhere, the way you would approach it, how did you get there and how did you do the research among people living on the mountains? You want to document that as well. Describe relevant backgrounds like I gave, and just talk about data collection and methods you use to analyze data. Aim here is to demonstrate as much as possible the authenticity of your research. So it's not just a thumbs up, well, we think XYZ. You just want to give someone to peek into what the research is and how rigorous you think the research or the research actually is. Your results should tell what we have learned or known or found from the research. Use bullet points where necessary. Bullet points are very good because they're catchy. You want to move from one bullet point to the other, to the other, to the other. But once you have a dense text of paragraphs, boy, oh boy, it is really, really a pain to go through a dense text, trying to figure out where the key points are. But when you see bullet points, it's easier to move from one to the next, and you grab the key points as you move along. So it's very important to keep that. It's very good for policy briefs when they are bullet pointed. Like you see on the screen now, there are bullet points there. So you would notice your eyes would go over them one after the other, and you grab all of them. If I had put all of them in a dense text, you would struggle to make sense of the points I'm trying to make here. Start by painting a general picture and then go into your specific. And then you need to conclude. Some people are fond of doing this. You have results, and then you have a recommendation you want to push, or your recommendations cannot be tied straight to your result. But somehow everyone knows general knowledge that this thing needs to be done. That's a recommendation. We just know this recommendation is necessary. Oh, UHC is a big thing. But your results don't talk to UHC. It doesn't mean that you have to now bring in UHC because everyone knows UHC is the mantra. So if your results don't talk to UHC, you don't have to talk to UHC. Talk straight to what your results lead you to. So don't sway into the general, oh, UHC is the main thing. I have to go on UHC. It's very important to keep that in mind. Let's see how messaging can be very interesting. Take a moment to look at this messaging. The first one is saying the country's adolescent birth rate increased to 80 per 1,000 girls aged 15 to 19 in 2021. If you send this to someone who doesn't understand what adolescent birth rate is and how it is even measured, I'm sure many of you may struggle to understand what adolescent birth rate is and how it is measured. Is it per 1,000 live births? Is it per 1,000 whatever? Is it per 1,000 girls? Is it or per 100,000? You're like, okay, what exactly is this? And what is 80 per 1,000? People struggle to understand rates when stated in that way. But on the other side, just look at it. You say in 2021, about 80 out of every 1,000 girls. Okay, it's easier to understand that. Or you say 8 out of 100. It's easier for someone to understand that compared to 80 per 1,000 girls aged. Gets really difficult. So one policymaker may be able to understand better. That's not to say policymaker may not be trained in epidemiology, in biostatistics, in health economics, or health informatics, or allied disciplines. But you don't want to be in a situation where you always want to know what training the health professional has before you develop a policy brief. Avoid that. Make it generic because he or she may delegate the task to someone else who you did not originally intend it to, and that person would struggle because you thought the minister is trained in biostatistics, is a professor of biostatistics, and then you wrote your policy brief in a way that the professor of biostatistics will understand. But here comes the professor of biostatistics and giving that policy brief to somebody who is maybe a permanent secretary, who has training in accountancy. And accountant is trying to understand what you mean by some jargon, and that becomes a challenge. You want to look at another one. The association between attaining secondary education and reduced early pregnancy is statistically significant at the 5% level. Okay, what is 5% level? What has this got? If you're not someone who understands basic statistics, you struggle. But you can put it the other way. Girls who complete secondary education are less likely to experience early pregnancy. And this finding is unlikely due to chance. It's not something that came out of chance. And you see how that really resonates with a policymaker. Oh, that's not a chance. It's really something that it's happening in my country. So girls that are unable to complete secondary school would have XYZ. So I must make sure they complete secondary school to avoid that. That's the other implications I'll come to in a while. Now look at this. There's a county called Akindo. Akindo County's contraceptive prevalence rate among adolescents is 35%. Okay, gets really hard to understand. But when you say 1 in 3 adolescents in Akindo County, in your county, Akindo, are using contraception. Okay, if contraception is a hard word, you may want to find a way to put it, but it's a general language people should understand contraception, at least adults. Adults should understand contraception. But if you think in your context, contraception is controversial or it's understandable, you now need to find another term for it. So that's why context matters. Then another one is approximately 68% of respondents reported significant barriers and bottlenecks to accessing adolescent sexual and reproductive health services. You look at the way I put the ASRH. Okay, what is ASRH? What is it? Services in Bongo municipality. So the municipality Bongo is struggling and has about 68% of respondents with significant barriers. You can flip it the other way and say, in your municipality, about 2.3 adolescents face difficulties in getting the health services they need. Okay, that really makes sense to me. Than ASRH, even though it doesn't convey the message perfectly, but at least it gets to a stage where you may be engaged later on to explain what kind of services are we talking about, rather than ASRH, which is technical. And lastly, you could have another one like the adjusted odds ratio of smoking, AOR equal to 2.3, 95% confidence interval of 1.4 to 3.3, very fancy, right? Was anticipated for the control group compared to the intervention group receiving counseling. Wow, that's very dense. So you're finding, you found that the adjusted odds ratio is that. You looked at 2 groups. One is a control group. One is an intervention group that received counseling, adolescent. You can write it simply by saying adolescents who did not receive counseling. You may want to qualify the counseling. I kept it generic, but usually the counseling should have exactly what it is. We're expected to be more likely to smoke. So if you did not receive counseling, you're expected to be more likely to smoke than those who received counseling. You see, it's the same way you've said the same thing in a more digestible format. And lastly, you have the unmet need for family planning among adolescents is high. What is that? You could say many adolescent girls who want to avoid or delay pregnancy are not using contraception. It's a way getting to unmet need in a way that one can understand, because the term unmet need is really technical. If you're not in that space of ASRH or SRH generally, or even family planning or population health or even demography. Now look at a very technical one using some graphs that economists use. Here you say On the left here, you see the graph of what we call the concentration curve and the concentration index. And I'm sure many of you here don't even know what this is. So it's an example. I deliberately put this in for audience that will be struggling with economics. You would notice you may not even know what this is saying. You need to be schooled to understand what this is saying. But what you see on the right here is exactly what you see on the left. But if you look at what is on the right, you would understand it. However you understand this is what you're seeing here. Does it seem obvious when you look at it? I don't think it seems obvious. So imagine a policymaker, you have this in your research article and you paste it in your policy brief, you've lost the policymaker. But if you translate it into something like this, that tells the policymaker that the share of adolescents without, here you're looking at the share of adolescents without secondary education here. And you could see that in this country or wherever it is, about 41% of adolescents who do not have secondary education are in the poorest quintile, whilst only 4% of those without any secondary education are found in the richest quintile. So it means those without secondary education, adolescents, are more in the poorest quintile. That's the message you want to pass. And that's what this message is saying here. But it doesn't seem clear at all. It doesn't seem clear. Good. So conclusion will tell us what the research was about. You want to use this section to interpret your data by also being persuasive. You need to be persuasive. Be concrete with your conclusions. Express ideas using strong assertions. Ensure that you have a balanced and defensible kind of policy conclusions. Aim to show how significant the issue at hand really is. Must flow from your evidence. Don't conclude UHC when you're dealing with something that is not directly UHC related. Though you can cram anything into UHC, but you have to be careful how you move from specific to general. Implications are what could happen. For example, and that's what I wanted to distinguish between policy recommendations and policy implications. Implications are what could happen. For example, if the province, whatever the province is, or country or county, does not reduce the incidence of alcohol abuse among adolescents, the government will lose $2 million yearly. That sinks in fast. If we do not do something about alcohol abuse among adolescents, we will lose $2 million every year. It's enough to get a policymaker on their feet to solve it. And that's an implication. A recommendation on the other way is what exactly government should now do to avoid the loss of the $2 million. That is the recommendation. Implications and recommendations are very similar. One flows from the other. So you need to understand that you avoid recommendations that are unsupported by your research. So you have a research that tells you something, and then you have a recommendation because you want to push UHC.
Yeah.
This country.
Chips and egg is salmon.
Okay, I guess I thought I was
How
interjected.
was the discussion like?
Sorry, Abubakar, you
No,
are.
not to do
Hello,
chips
Abubakar.
and egg.
Hello, Abubakar. Can you mute, please? Or can someone mute him or her? Can someone help mute
Transfer or
Abubakar,
that's 14 pies.
please?
So is it transfer or this?
Hello, okay, good, thanks. Great. Sorry about the distraction. So implications are what will happen or could happen if you don't do something. Recommendations are what then should you do to avoid that thing from happening. Use bullet points. Remember that implications, if this, then that will happen. If not that, that will happen. For example, recommendations, you call for action. I did talk a lot about this already. Your implications, you describe what the researcher thinks will be the consequences. They're less direct than recommendations, but they are ways to point towards your recommendations, and useful when advice is not requested. So if we do not request your advice, and minister doesn't want your advice, use implications. And that sends signals. You don't necessarily need to tell her that these are the recommendations. Say, well, if you don't do something, that will happen, and leave it at that. But usually recommendations should follow that describes clearly what should happen next. State them as precise as possible and go straight to the point. Make sure they're credible, they're relevant, and they're feasible. Some recommendations are not feasible. For example, if you find, I usually use the example, if we find that communities, a particular condition is less severe in an Islamic community compared to a Hindu community, it doesn't mean that you now say, well, to be able to ensure that we have reduction in that condition, everyone should be, all Hindus people who practice Hinduism should become Muslims, for example. Or you have a particular condition is more prevalent among men than women, and we want to reduce it. We change people's sexes because once they become that sex, you've solved the problem. So you need to figure out how you word your recommendations. Some things are not actionable. So you need to understand. So you begin to use what we call correlates. What correlates? The fact that this is happening in a Muslim community may be because of something that they do, not necessarily because of their religion. Because sometimes you put in religion as a marker for many things. So don't just go straight to religion and say, well, men do this better than women, so women should become men. You can't achieve that. Perhaps if women do things better than men, it may be an underlying concept in how they do it. So your policy recommendations around it, how they do it, as opposed to the face value that women do things better than men, so or men should become women, kind of, doesn't, if you understand what I mean. Okay, aesthetics matters. Like I said, try to use aesthetics, bring in pictures, layouts, sidebars. Sidebars are bars that appear on the side. Do grammar checks, make sure that there are fewer errors to none. Rule of thumb, if you cannot understand what you've written at the age of 18, chances are that it is not written for the layperson. So if you take whatever you've written, give it to an 80-year-old girl or lady and tell her to read it, or a boy, and they are unable to read it and understand it, it's a problem, and you have to rewrite it. Avoid academic references as much as possible unless it is required by an organization or whoever wants the policy brief written. But usually these references distract you. For example, if I see 1 in bracket, I want to go to a footnote or go to the end. What is this 1 saying? What exactly? Or you have a footnote somewhere that tells me 2. Okay, I'll go and read the 2. And before I finish reading the 2, I've lost my train of thought. I have to now go back to, catch up, and it gets really confusing. I've talked a bit about other information, like noting your original research paper and contact details, usually at the end of a paper rather than upfront. Is usually very helpful. Have a clear dissemination strategy. How are you going to move this from your writing into wherever it's ending up? You must have that at the back of your mind. And I want to highlight that there are kind of some checklists that you might put in place. There are many of them. I'm not saying you go with this checklist, but there are possible checklists that you may use to say, well, have I done this well? Have I not done it well? How to do or not to do, kind of thing. Did I define my problem clearly? Did I establish why action is urgent? If I didn't do that, I need to put it in. Have I really identified my audience with actionable power related to that topic, of course, not just random? Have I been able to present my evidence in a way that is digestible to that audience? Was I convincing enough to identify the key policy implementation gaps, for example? Did I present feasible evidence-based policy options that are actionable? Did I really specify concrete actions that the target audience could action on related to the one above? Did I really address equity? And because sometimes you want to bring in equity and diversity into what you do. So you're not just focusing on one group, but you're looking at the usual stratifiers. Did I align my recommendations with national and regional commitments? Because that's another way to get in. If something is UHC related, you want to bring UHC. If it is related to Abuja Declaration, you want to bring it in. If it's related to something that you think, oh, it's the Accra Reset or the Lusaka Agenda, for example, oh yeah, it has to do with donor funding of sexual and reproductive health. I think this is tied to the Lusaka Agenda, and governments are signing on to that. You want to bring that on to be able to make sure you achieve what you want. There are many of those things you might want to look at. And you want to make your policy brief concise, visually appealing, and of course, decision-oriented. So solution-oriented. You don't want a policy brief that doesn't solve problems. And I think with that, I come to the end, and I thank you. I think it's a long one. Thank you, everyone. Over to you, Mariana.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Taguba, for sharing such valuable insights. So we will now move into the QA session. And Danny, I would like to know if we already have some submitted questions, or if not, we can ask participants to raise their hands and ask the questions that they may have.
Thank you.
Danny?
Yes, we do not have questions in the chat yet. Yes, but keep your chats coming. Yeah, but as it stands, we don't have questions in the chat yet.
Thank you, Danny. So please, participants, we are now in the QA session. Please feel free to ask the questions or contributions you may have. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. My name is Delali. I'm just wondering whether I missed that session, but I'm wondering the word limits. Is there a word limit for a policy brief? If Prof can elaborate on that.
Thank you so much, Delali. The simple answer is no. Okay. But the longer answer is yes, which is kind of right, because no is short and yes is longer than no. 3 words, and no is 2 words, 2 letters, sorry. So what I mean by that is I did talk about maybe 2 to 4 pages. The reason being that you don't want a policymaker to be reading a thesis. I, for one, I struggle to even read thesis myself. So you can imagine what it means for a very busy policymaker to begin to read a thesis. So you want to keep it short and crispy. So aim for about 2 to 4 pages. Avoid very tiny fonts, depending on how you print it. Avoid very tiny fonts. Don't make it very tiny. It gets really painful to read tiny fonts. So you aim for font size that is readable, 12, 13, yeah, should be fine. Yeah. Does that help?
Yes,
Delali?
thank you, Prof. My other issue is how to assess the effectiveness of your policy brief. Sometimes you design, you share, and then perhaps what you are actually looking forward to seeing, you don't see it in a long while. So do we give up as communication people, or I mean, I just want to know how to assess the effectiveness of your policy brief.
Very, very good question you've asked here. The effectiveness of any knowledge translation product, not just a policy. I mean, you can even look at it from articles, is usually very difficult to measure. But when you get to a policy brief, it may even be easier to measure it. Reason being that, remember, when you started with a policy brief, you have your problem and you've come up with solutions. You may be able to judge whether the solution is visible or not. If, for example, you're looking at introducing school feeding, if I give a random example, school feeding, because you feel like adolescent girls are not doing well because they are not fed well at home, so you want them to be fed at school. Or you're looking at adolescent girls who miss days at school because of their periods. And then you come up with a policy brief, you did a research, and one of the things you found was the average days that girls miss at school over the last 10 years has been maybe 2 days per child per month. I'm giving a rough example. I don't know what the research actually says. So maybe 2 days per month. But you've done your policy brief based on your research, you did your policy brief, and maybe a policy was instituted to provide free sanitary products to girls, whether at home, at school, anywhere. This is being accompanied by maybe some kind of pain killer or medication to kind of numb pain. And you've seen that the mean or average days missed at school dropped from 2 to 0.2, giving again a rough example. Then you may be able to link it to your policy brief, but that's a long stretch. The reason why it's a long stretch is that there could be other policies happening all at once that you may not attribute directly to your policy brief, but you can conclude that your policy brief contributed to it because that's in that direction. Now, that's a quantitative way of seeing results. There are also qualitative ways. So it's not just, we don't see evidence by looking at quantitative. I'm very, very careful to say that because most things go qualitatively. You may be able to see changes in practices. You may be able to see visible changes like even the provision of the product itself, or even the introduction of new guidelines, blah, 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 are things that you may be able to use to assess whether your policy has made, your policy brief has moved an needle. Now, don't look for big changes. It's a big problem. Never be looking, don't go out there looking for big changes that have changed the world. All you need to see is just a needle, something moved. Little bits and pieces all come together to form a whole. So these little changes that you see all culminate into something bigger. So yeah, I hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Pleasure.
Yeah, there are some questions in the chat.
Yeah, let me see.
Maybe I should read out some 2 questions out, and you take that, and then we can read the next batch of questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you.
Okay, so this one comes from Rosemont, and she says, I'm Rosemont from Burkina Faso. My question is about methodology presentation. Prof, you said, for example, that logistic regression is not technical. Can I have an alternative? It's more technical. Can I have an alternative preposition?
Okay, let me start.
She's asking something like logistic regression, perhaps maybe a more technical term. And so if there's an alternative, term to replace that, perhaps that's my understanding of the question.
Yes. I think
And
that also goes.
the second question is from Jean Yarrow. In my opinion, okay, it's not necessarily a question. I think it's a contribution. In my opinion, executive summary should not be optional because this usually helps target audience to quickly adopt to read the policy brief. So it's more of a contribution than a question. Thank you, and over.
Okay, no, thanks. I agree with you, Jean Yaro. The reason why I'd say it's optional is depends on where you're coming from. I encourage it. If not, I wouldn't have put it in here. I encourage you to have an executive summary or highlight of whatever you want to call it. Now let me come to Rosemond. So, very good question. Why not logistic regression? Okay. If I ask you at the age of 18, you just maybe high school, what logistic regression is, you would shake your head and like, what logic are we talking about? What is it logistics in terms of moving vehicles or logistics kind of? So what you usually do is understand the context behind logistic regression. A policy maker does not need to know this difference between logistic regression, a probit regression, a negative binomial regression. I can go on and on about many of the types of regression. You say, okay, well, I have a truncated model, so I use a Tobit regression. Okay, because we want to pass the message on. Oh no, you know what? I studied my error structure and it has this good sigmoid function. Okay, because it follows a sigmoid function. Then I'm using technical terms to see how difficult it is. Okay, now it's a sigmoid function. It's a logistic regression. Oh no, this is a Gaussian distribution. Okay, that's probit. I'll use the probit. Okay, that's technical. But the policymaker does not want to know whether something is a sigmoid function, it's a Gaussian distribution, or it's an F distribution. What they may want to know is whether there's something is related to another thing. That's the context of regression. Is this thing related or associated with that thing? A associated with B. Once you understand that, your message is basically passing. What the message you want to pass is you studied whether I used an example, one of my examples, whether I think I talked about alcohol abuse, education related to alcohol abuse, I think, or smoking, education and smoking, or counseling. I use counseling, smoking, any of them. So you want to see, instead of saying, when you run your regression, smoke or not smoking, smoking or non-smoking will be 0, 1. Okay, and you run different variables to predict whether they smoke or not, and one of the variables might be education. So instead of saying you run a logistic regression to figure out the determinants or factors associated with smoking in Burkina Faso, you just basically avoid this jargon of logistic or whatever regression and say your study was about understanding the relationship between smoking, education attainment, and smoking in Burkina Faso. And that gives a message. You don't necessarily need to say it's a logistic regression, but you wanted to see the relationship between education level or educational attainment of adolescents and smoking in Burkina Faso. That's enough. You don't need to say logistic. The one who wants to read about logistic will pick it up in the big paper at the end. Yeah. I hope that really helps you. You can come back if you still need more. Yeah. Rosemont, sorry.
Okay. I think there are more questions in the chat, but in the meantime, I don't know whether Mariama will want to check if there are people who wants to speak before I read some of the questions in the chat.
Yes, Danny. Thank you. And I would like to ask the participants if there is someone who would like to make a contribution or who has a question, please.
Okay, maybe we should.
Danny, yeah, maybe we should go to the chat while we wait.
Sure. Thank you, Mariama. I think there's a question from Patrick. He who says, can you share a link with us where we can view some policy brief samples? Are there any steps I can apply to ensure that my policy brief is void of technical jargons? This is coming from Patrick. Maybe you want to take that before I go to the next.
Yes. Thank you. That's Patrick Oluwafisayomi. The question is very straightforward. Let me start with the last one. Are there any steps I can take to apply to ensure that my policy brief is void of technical jargon? Yes, I give you an example. Take that policy brief, give it to someone who's age 18 or 17, tell them to read it and ask them, do they understand what it is? If they don't understand what you've written, chances are that the policymaker may not, I'm not saying will not, may not understand it. Because if you understand, some of these policymakers are not experts in that area. For example, I've worked in countries where, I'm currently even working in a country where the permanent secretary within the Ministry of Health is an accountant. I use that example. So in that context, one has to be careful how you want the person to be able to move the needle. But if they don't understand, they are experts in their field. No one doubts that. But now they are in an area where they will have to learn and struggle. So you need to make it digestible for them to be able to make policy impact. Then the other one, sharing links. I'm always skeptical about sharing links. It's like saying, John endorsed this, John did not endorse the other one. Oh, I endorsed A, I don't endorse B. That said, we have a couple of policy briefs on our own website that you may want to consider. So if you go to the AfHEA's website, I don't have the exact link, we'll be able to point you to some of our website or some of our policy briefs. But what I would encourage you is not look at the policy brief as gold standard, because every policy brief is based on an organization's instruction, for example, may be based on an organization's instruction. So if you're targeting a different organization, they might have a different policy brief structure. There is a policy brief that we are writing for the WHO and IDRC on the topic we're dealing with, financing sexual and reproductive health for adolescents. As soon as that one comes out, for example, we may be able to share how can we increase financing of adolescent sexual and reproductive health globally. Perhaps that might also be helpful. There are many, but I don't want to point you to one and say, well, that's the gold standard, and then suddenly you feel. Just judge each policy brief against the criteria I just gave. Which one meets, which one doesn't meet, you should be able to distill. And we are here as part of if you are part of the ANISA initiative, I will be available as a resource person if you're dealing with writing a policy brief and you need inputs. If you're part of the ANISA initiative within the West Africa region, or even in the East and Southern Africa region, I'm happy to also assist. Thanks. I can even read the question. Let me see. I see another one from Andrea. Andrea is, where should independent researchers seek to share their policy briefs to have impact? How do we tangibly assess decision makers? Okay, assessing decision makers is one I talked about. It's usually very difficult, but there are ways you can get around it. I did talk a bit about seeing whether a policy is already instituted, but you cannot ascribe it to your own policy brief. Remember, there are many things happening at once. There might be an internal process within the Ministry of Health that your policy brief kind of caught up with. So you may not just attribute, but you could say it may be contributed to that process. Where do you put your policy brief? Journals have outlets, like you have Journal of Health Economics, Journal of Health Policy, you have Health Policy and Planning, you have Journal of Mathematics, whatever. There is no outlet of policy brief in Africa, kind of or something. I'm making up a name. There are no outlets designed like that for policy briefs. So usually policy briefs are posted on websites of organizations, and they are also delivered in person to whoever it was written for. I mean, it mustn't be someone who's named, but an authority, that office. So the dissemination happens face to face, can be virtually through your website, and you may also disseminate it through social media, through other media outlets, like I did mention earlier. If you remember from the first few slides, you may use those media outlets to also disseminate your policy brief. There's no hard and fast rule. There's no journal outlet there for policy briefs. Maybe there will soon be, but until then, we have to use the ways I described. Then there's a question here from Felix. My question is, what is the difference between a research brief versus a policy brief? Can researchers seek the help of communication experts to write policy briefs, or is it the duty of researchers to communicate their research findings to policymakers? Very loaded question there. Let me start by saying writing a policy brief is not necessarily something I would say researchers must do, but researchers are encouraged to do that. And it's good to do that in conjunction with communication experts, especially people who are versed in communicating to different audiences. Academics are bad at that because we are trained mainly to write journal papers. You notice if an academic writes a policy brief for the first time, it's replete with jargon. You see everywhere jargon everywhere. You have to now figure out how to water it down. So sometimes it's good to work with someone who is knowledgeable in communication. There is a difference between a research brief and a policy brief. The answer is in the question. One is a brief research, one is a brief policy. So the focus of these two pieces, their focuses are different. One is focusing on policy. The other one is research. So it's obvious from the name. That said, while it seemed obvious, that said, some people also confuse it with evidence brief, which is similar to research brief. I did mention that earlier. Let me try and go quickly to that, which is I'm glad this came up. And that was why I'm happy I put in there the different, that one. You would see, okay, let's go here. Great. Yep. So you would see here I did put some different kinds of briefs. There's a policy brief, there's evidence brief for policy, which is similar to policy briefs. But here you bring in just evidence brief for a technical advisor, maybe within the Ministry of Health. They might have a health economist who is a technical advisor. And you're writing something that has to do with changing a health financing structure. But this technical advisor within the Ministry of Health is a health economist. He or she understands some of this jargon we're going to deal with. So when you're sending that kind of research brief or whatever you want to call it, or evidence brief, you are happy to include some of the technical terms because you know exactly who's handling it. There's a health economist trained to deal with health financing challenges. So you will not be running around trying to look for synonyms that would make it fancy. You can go straight and talk about catastrophic cost. He or she, if he's a trained health economist, a good one, should know what you're talking about. And he's a health financing expert and is struggling to understand catastrophic costs, then he or she shouldn't be there to even change policy in the first place. So these are different products that you may target to different people. Another one is fact sheets. It's very concise. It's just laying out facts. Fact sheets came out when, for example, there was Ebola in Nigeria, Sierra Leone. Many of you would have seen these sheets flying around. So they're putting out there to dispel misinformation. They will tell you if you don't get Ebola by doing X, you don't get HIV by drinking water, or all those kind of misconceptions that people have. So fact sheets are sent out usually to public. You could also do it to policymakers, media, or you just send it out containing key facts and dispel rumors that you don't say, well, HIV is gotten by drinking water or shaking hands with someone who's living with HIV, for example. Yeah, I hope that really helps in answering your question, Felix, but I'm happy to go further if needed. Any other questions? I don't see.
Yes, we would like to know from the participants if there is any other question or comment. Oh, Felix Obi has a hand raised. So please, Felix.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Prof. Thanks for your answer. I actually decided to share that question because different researchers have different experiences, and also I've written policy briefs before, but I just felt that question was going to be helpful to everyone. So thank you for the response, which really addressed it. So the other question I wanted to bring is, I know it's not directly related to policy briefs, but there is also, from a previous project I worked on, so I was the person in charge of research uptake. So because I believe it's relevant to this research uptake. And my role was to translate the research we do into policy briefs, engage with different stakeholders, including the media. So I feel that for AfHEA, I think this might be an opportunity for us. Okay, how can researchers engage with the media? So some of the things I was doing then was sometimes after this was under health policy research group, so the resilient and responsive health system. So it was a multi-country. So the studies we did in Nigeria, one of the things we are doing was to organize sections with the media. So I had sections with the media where they develop fact sheets or what we call media kits. So it can be like a summary of the research. It's not necessarily policy brief, but some kind of fact sheets or technical brief that the media can use to publicize and communicate our studies, because they will not go to the journal to read up the peer-reviewed paper. So I think it may be something for us as researchers and under AfHEA to think of, okay, look, beyond the policymaker, who else can we target our research output and share with them in a concise way that they understand? So several times I've had situations where we develop like maybe a press release, for instance, or a blog about the study we have done, and then share it with media colleagues, and they published it. So the research is leaving the journal pages and is appearing on your regular newspaper or on their website, and so making the research outputs much more accessible to the people who need them. So this is about the public engagement of science. Here is a comment as well as a question. So, okay, look, what can we do more? How do we encourage more researchers, especially the young, early researchers or even experienced ones, to go outside the four walls of the university, or if we are doing research programs outside the university, how best do we ensure that we engage with our community? Community by, I mean, both the media, the stakeholders, and all, so that our research can be translated in a way that people understand it easily and then can relate with it. Thank you.
Absolutely, Felix. You've kind of touched on many things there. I cannot agree more. Two things I wanted to add to that is another way we disseminate this is, which we kind of underplay, is granting media interviews. Feel free as researchers to be open to granting media interviews. It helps you move your research again into a different sphere. Then the other one is very common, especially within academics, trying to bridge the gap between policy and hardcore research is the conversation. The conversation is usually published online. Whether the readership goes beyond the academia is another thing to deal with. But it exists to move from the very technical research language to more liberal way of presenting evidence or research output. And that's adding on to what Felix said, which I cannot dispute. Thanks. Any more questions? I see there are other comments. Oh, no, okay.
Yes, I think in terms of the sample, policy briefs, I see Alex dropping some links on our website, and I also see Grace sharing some links on for policy sample policy briefs on from WHO. And then I also see Patrick with another comment. I'm not sure. Just give me a minute and let me see if I can pull it out again. Yeah, is it Patrick? Somebody says, please, I've heard of fact sheets, but I've not really seen samples around. Could you mention any website we can see samples? I'm not sure where.
Grace did that. I can see Grace did put that. I don't want to belabor the point because she's presented it already for them. So
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Over to you, Mariana.
Thank you, Danny. I would like to thank the all for this very interesting discussion. I believe that we would like to continue, but we have to come to a close. And I would like to ask Professor Nomtondo to provide the closing remarks. But before, I would like to acknowledge the Global Affairs Canada, the Canadian Institute of Health Research, and the International Development Research Center for their financial support for this webinar. I would also like to inform that we have an evaluation form, and the purpose of this is to help improve the organization of future events. And we would like to invite everyone to complete it. Danny will later inform us if it's already ready to be shared or not. So for now, I would like to invite Professor Nomtondo to deliver the closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mariana. Nous remercions chaleureusement le professeur Atagouba pour sa belle présentation qui nous a édifié sur la note d'orientation, qui est un document scientifique destiné à un public non spécialiste et aux décideurs politiques. Son objectif est de résumer un problème précis, de fournir des recommandations concrètes et actionnables basées sur des données probantes. Et sa rédaction doit répondre directement aux intérêts, aux prérogatives, aux besoins d'urgence des décideurs. Le ton doit être persuasif, concis, exempt de jargon académique. Pour ce qui est de la structure, cette note doit être articulée autour d'un résumé analytique, avec une introduction qui contextualise le problème, une description très simplifiée de la méthodologie présentant les résultats clés et une conclusion. On peut tenir compte pour cela de la checklist proposée par le professeur Atagouba. Il faut également faire la distinction entre l'implication et la recommandation. Les implications décrivent les conséquences possibles d'une action ou d'une inaction. Les recommandations préconisent les étapes précises et faisables à appliquer. Puis, pour présenter notre document, il doit être clair, concis, pour capter l'attention du décideur, le persuader et proposer une action immédiate. Et nous avons donc retenu cela pour cette présentation. Nous voulons remercier nos partenaires qui ont soutenu ce webinaire, notamment AfHEA Mondial Canada, les instituts de recherche en santé du Canada, le Centre de recherche pour le développement international. Et ce webinaire a été conçu dans le cadre de l'initiative Aborder les domaines négligés de la santé et des droits sexuels et reproductifs en Afrique subsaharienne. J'espère que nous avons retenu tout ce que le professeur Atagouba nous a présenté. Les échanges ont été très riches et fructueux et nous vous invitons pour une prochaine session et nous vous remercions. Merci, Dr. Mariana.
Thank you very much, Professor Namtando. I would like to ask Danny to inform us about the evaluation form. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, Mariana, the evaluation form is ready. We have already put the link in the chat. Please kindly access the link and complete this for us. We'll also share this via email. In case you miss it on the chat, you can still go back to your emails and get a link and fill this for us. As you mentioned, the purpose is to ensure that we do better in future engagements. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Danny. So with that, we have come to the end of today's webinar. Thank you again for your time, and I wish you all a very good day. Goodbye.
Bye-bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Mariana. Thank you, John. Thank
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
Namtando.
Pleasure.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Right.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Good luck.